And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, we thank the Secretary General for his report on R2P and its application in the context of sustainable development. I thought was commendable. However, in an ideal world, distinguished delegates and excellencies, undoubtedly, all states should take responsibility to protect their populations. It's a sine qua non, perhaps. However, in reality, projecting this responsibility onto an international scale remains problematic in my respectful view. For there will always be the issue of who should act, when, and how. The adoption of specific threshold and precautionary principles would be a crucial step, in my view, to making it harder for states to employ false humanitarian claims. It is argued that they would strengthen strong arguments and weaken weak ones, which matters for governments that fail to persuade other states, the media, and the global public opinion, and risk condemnation and sanctions in consequence of this principle. Excellencies, without the adoption of such principles, and without considerable Security Council reform, which still remains highly unlikely, the real politic of our global order will continue to undermine the R2P concept. Therefore, it is currently still far from, I say, from being able to effectively make our world a more secure place. In our international order, states are duty bearers towards individuals and communities, are endowed with inalienable rights, and have the obligation to secure those rights now and over time. Now, this means that it is the duty of states to prevent serious violations, not only of civil and political rights, but also of economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights that fuel cases of international crimes. And Sustainable Development in the World Commission on Environment and Development's original definition clearly encompasses this human rights angle, especially with respect to the lives of future generations. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. If states fail to meet the universal agreed goal of sustainable development, future generations are liable to be victims of living conditions below agreed human rights standards. I say this because in the traditional sense, the concept of the responsibility to protect has challenged the natural order of the international system by providing a different understanding of state sovereignty, including state accountability. Distinguished delegates, it is clear then, even though there is a tension between state sovereignty, sustainable development, and the defense of human rights, it is possible to overcome this clash by looking at sovereignty as the state's responsibility towards the protection of its own citizens, rather than merely as a mechanism available for unbridled power. It therefore must be appreciated that the responsibility to protect doctrine specifies that the primary responsibility to protect relies within the state itself and not with the international community, and this must be appreciated. The general idea is that sovereignty and military intervention should be seen as counterbalancing factors, where military intervention should be used as the last resort. The resolutions on R2P ratified by the General Assembly in 2005 tried to overcome many tensions that prevailed, but it still recognized the ultimate authority of the Security Council. Each state had a responsibility to protect its population. The resolution said but collective action was to be taken through the Security Council in accordance with the Charter, including Chapter 7, on a case-by-case basis. Why, I ask, is this relevant? I say it is relevant, my dear friends, because it points to the fact that R2P is a mere aspiration, and that must be appreciated, as one academic puts it, and a rather weak one at that, as opposed to a real principle of international norms or even international law. R2P sometimes not only runs against the practices of practical politics, where national sovereignty still reigns supreme, but more importantly, it is at odds with a fundamental principle of the United Nations itself, namely the ultimate legal deference to national sovereignty as decided by the national members of the Security Council. The Council may approve of the concept with respect on one case, but does not do so in the case of another, because certain members of the P5 are at cross purposes. Now, its protagonists often say that intervening in the face of mass murder is an option that cannot be relinquished, undoubtedly. Now, that cannot be more true, but we don't need R2P to exercise that option. Whether the UN Security Council authorizes such an intervention will always be one of a practical judgment. Excellencies, no one is prepared to defend the claim that states can do what they want with their people and then hide behind the principle of sovereignty. There is no justification for core crimes of genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc. In 2001, the ICISS has called on the international community, its members and nations and non-governmental organizations to embrace the idea of the responsibility to protect as a basic element in the Code of Global Citizenship and its vital necessity. Distinguished delegates, but it is critical, I say, that we make the observation regarding the responsibility to protect concept, because it emphasizes that the history of the responsibility to protect doctrine sounds almost like a fairy tale. One of its most striking aspects appears to be the gap between the promise and the reality. Although state representatives and international organizations permanently endorse the concept, single states and groups of states continue to emphasize the significance of state sovereignty with regard to the domestic affairs of a state, to point out the limited competencies of the Security Council, and to emphasize that the responsibility to protect has yet not gained legal force. Distinguished delegates, it must be appreciated that the R2P doctrine is riddled with too many contradictions and practical problems to make a serious doctrine for implementation. However, we cannot also forget the fact that the responsibility to protect is an ambitious project which represents a vital opportunity for the world community to transform its understanding of humanitarian intervention better, rather than a new license to intervene militarily. R2P challenges and obligates nations to affirm and realize socio-economic rights in the developing world. Countries coming out of prolonged armed conflict urgently depend upon the socio-economic development to avoid relapsing into violence and brutality. The Sustainable Development Goals provide a framework for defining and prioritizing the most essential development needs, as well as a blueprint for investing and focusing development assistance in individual countries. Implementing a social welfare version of R2P through the SDGs will require innovative fundraising strategies, including the transformation and channeling of private credit in the public interest and a robust global financial architecture. Distinguished delegates, improving women's access to food, employment, education, and reproductive and other health services are at the heart of Sustainable Development Goals. Such efforts are also crucial in fighting poverty, protecting children, lessening economic inequality, and preventing social instability and armed conflict at the global level, and therefore should be central aspects of the responsibility to protect. The Sustainable Development Goals are essential benchmarks for countries at risk of war and repression, as well as those struggling to emerge from armed conflict and humanitarian emergencies. Excellencies, when states embrace R2P through the SDGs, they commit to a human security partnership with countries in socio-economic distress in pursuit of long-term conflict resolution. For human rights activists, this human welfare-centered vision of the responsibility to protect is an essential reminder that social justice and civil liberties are equal pillars of and partners in the global human rights movement. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka and